Good morning. This is your stat sensei, Mr. Spensei, and we're on page 227 of your note spiral, and we'll be looking at computer printouts for regression. And we're just going to learn how to read a few things off a computer printout that's going to be real important for the class. This is fairly easy, but super important that we actually learn it. All right, so um, we have lots of numbers. It looks confusing, et cetera, but there's something that will identify and help us out immediately. When we find the word constant, that's what we want to look for. And it could be up here, it could be down there, but we find the word constant, that means that entire row of constant refers to the y-intercept. So that's my y-intercept row. So you probably should write that off to the side, y-intercept row, to remind you. And the row immediately below it refers to the slope. So everything in the pink row is our slope row. So that yellow row is our y-intercept, and we know it because of constant. And the row below it is the slope row. All right. Well, I'm going to ask you on the assignment to identify the explanatory variable. And you're like, gosh, what's the explanatory variable? It's just your x. It's your input. So the explanatory variable is your x or input, and it's always directly below the word constant. So my explanatory variable in this case is just plain old distance. And that's my x variable. And by the way, a regression equation, I should start off with this, is just based on y equals mx plus b, slope intercept. We are going to change that around because we're stats and we're going to change this around a bit, but it's based on that. That's what we're basically working with. Well, the next thing I asked for is the y-intercept. Well, I go to the y-intercept row, and right under coefficient, I have my y-intercept. And so my y-intercept, or my b, would have been 177.215. The next thing I'm going to ask for is my actual slope. Well, that means I need to go to the slope row, and I need to be under coefficient. And my slope is 0.0786. And you may need to watch this video a couple times, and it's going to be fairly short to memorize where everything is, but it's super important that you memorize it. The next thing is not on it. It's going to ask for the regression equation, and we're going to write it like this. Instead of y equals mx plus b, we're going to write it like y equals b plus mx. All right. Now, if you write it y equals mx plus b, I'll still give you full credit, but I want to write it as y equals b plus mx. But instead of y, we're going to use y hat because that came from the sample. So y hat, and then I was looking for b. Oh, that's this. This is 177.215. So there's my y-intercept. I'm going to label it here. You don't need to. That's my y-intercept plus 0.0786. There's my slope. And we need to follow that with an x. Now, that x we've already talked about is distance. So I could have just plugged distance right there. Okay? All right. The next thing is I'm going to ask you for the standard error of the slope. Standard error of the slope. That means I need to be looking at the slope row, and there it is, SE, standard error. Sometimes they'll refer to it as the standard deviation. And standard error or standard deviation of the slope in this case is just 0.0204. All right, 0.0204. And you know what? I'm going to go back and label a couple things. So this was A. This is my y-intercept, which was B. This is my slope, which is C. This is standard error of the slope, which is letter E. The next thing I'm going to ask you for is the t-statistic of the slope. T-statistic of the slope. I have two t-statistics, but I'm specifically asking for the slope one. So that means I need to be on the slope row. And this is my t-statistic for the slope. Well, that was letter F. And that value is just 3.86 right here, letter F. The next thing it's going to ask you is for the p-value of the slope, which means I need to be on the slope row, and there's my p-value, and that's letter G. So that's 0.0014. All right, so that's letter G. And the very last thing I'm going to ask you for is the coefficient of determination. Well, the coefficient of determination is your R squared. Well, you'll notice we have two R squared. We have R squared adjusted. We're not going to use that in this class. So we're just going to be talking about R squared, and that's my coefficient of determination. I'm just going to call it CD, coefficient of determination. And on our your assignment, that will be letter H. So letter H, our R squared, coefficient of determination, is 48.2%. Go ahead and write it as a percent. So 48.2%. So real quickly, there's my X variable. There's my Y-intercept. Here's my slope. Here's my standard error of the slope. Here's my t-statistic. Here's my p-value for slope. And here is my coefficient of determination, or R squared. And once again, if I were writing my regression equation, I would write it as y hat equals 177.215 plus 0.0786x. Now, sometimes you'll see it written like this. Well, actually, I'm just going to leave it at that for today. So y hat equals 177.215 plus 0.0786. And hopefully you'll be able to find everything on your computer printouts from now on. And super important that you get this. If you have questions, please be sure to ask. All right, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.